And I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes. But in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
I was born in a house my father built. My birth was on the night of January 9th, 1913, coincided with a record-breaking cold snap in our town of Yorba Linda, California. Yorba Linda was a farming community of 200 people about 30 miles from Los Angeles, surrounded by avocado and citrus groves and barley, alfalfa, and bean fields. For a child, the setting was idyllic. In the spring, the air was heavy with a rich scent of orange blossoms, and there was much to excite a child's imagination. Glimpses of the Pacific Ocean to the west, the San Bernardino Mountains to the north, a haunted house in the nearby foothills to be viewed with awe and approached with caution, and a railroad line that ran about a mile from our house. In the daytime, I would see the smoke from the steam engines. Sometimes at night I was awakened by the whistle of a train. And then I dreamed of the far-off places I wanted to visit someday. My brothers and I played railroad games, taking the parts of the engineers and the conductors. I remember the thrill of talking to Everett Burnham, the Santa Fe Railroad engineer who lived in our town. My first conscious memories of running. I was 3 years old and my mother was driving us in a horse-drawn buggy, holding my baby brother Don in her lap while the neighbor girl held me. The horse turned a corner leading to our house at high speed, and I tumbled onto the ground. I must have been in shock, but I managed to get up and run after the buggy while my mother tried to make the horse stop. The only after effect of this accident was that years later, when the vogue of parting hair on the left side came along, I still had to comb mine straight back to hide a scar caused by the fall. Our life in Yorba Linda was hard but happy. My father worked at whatever jobs he could find. Thanks to a vegetable garden and some of our own fruit trees, we had plenty to eat despite our low income. We also had a cow that provided milk from which my mother made our butter and cheese. I started first grade in Yorba Linda's schoolhouse when I was 6. My mother had already taught me to read at home, and this head start enabled me to skip the second grade. After homework and chores, I often sat by the fireplace or at the kitchen table immersed in a book or a magazine. We took the Los Angeles Times, the Saturday Evening Post, and the Ladies' Home Journal. Aunt Olive, my mother's youngest sister, and her husband, Oscar Marshburn, lived in nearby Whittier, subscribed to the National Geographic. In 1922, my father sold our home in Lemon Grove in Yorba Linda, and we moved to Whittier. He did roustabout work in the oil fields, although it paid well, this physical labor offered no challenge to a man of his ambition, intelligence, and lively imagination. Early on, my father could see that even though there were still very few automobiles and only one paved road in the area, the horseless carriage was an idea whose time was about to come. He borrowed $5,000 to buy some land on the main road connecting growing towns of Whittier, La Habra. He cleared the lot, put in a tank and a pump, and opened the first service station in the 8-mile stretch between the two towns. The enterprise was an almost instant success, and he soon opened a general store and the market. He added a small counter for my mother's home-baked pies and cakes. One of her specialties was angel food cake. She insisted it was at its best when she beat fresh outdoor air into the batter before putting it into the oven. I remember her standing outside the kitchen door in the chilly pre-dawn air, beating the batter with a big wooden. The grocery business expanded rapidly, and had it not been for the illness that struck our family, we would have been modestly well off in the standards of those times. The Nixon family market was a mom-and-pop operation. The whole family worked in the store. In addition to waiting on the customers and keeping the accounts, inventory had to be taken, orders placed, and the shelves kept stocked. The store had to be cleaned and swept each night and sprayed for flies each day. When I was older, I took over the fresh fruit and vegetable buying. Each morning I got up at 4 in order to be at the 7th Street Market in Los Angeles by 5 o'clock. I chose the best fruits and vegetables, bargained with farmers and wholesalers for a good price, and then drove back to East Whittier to wash, sort, and arrange the produce in the store and be off to school by 8. It was not an easy life, but it was a good one, centered around a loving family and a small, tight-knit Quaker community. For those who were willing to work hard, California in the 1920s seemed to be a place of almost unlimited opportunity. The principle that opposites attract aptly applied to my mother and my father. In the most important ways, they were very much alike. Both were deeply religious. They were completely devoted to one another, and no sacrifice was too great for them to make for their children. But two more temperamentally different people could be hardly imagined. My father, Francis Anthony Nixon, was known throughout his life as Frank. He was born on a farm in Ohio on December 3, 1878. His mother died of tuberculosis when he was 8, and her long illness left the family almost penniless. After her death, the family moved to a small barren plot in eastern Ohio, where my father had to walk several miles each day to the nearest school. After her death, the family moved to a small barren plot in eastern Ohio, where my father had to walk several miles each day to the nearest school. A newcomer, small in stature and dressed in ragged clothes, he was taunted by his schoolmates. He responded with quick tongue and a ready pair of fists, and he soon became known as a natural fighter. The family fortunes did not improve, and after he had finished the 6th grade, he quit school and went to work. It was a necessary decision, but one he regretted all his life. Over the next few years, he held many jobs, acquiring new skills with each. He drove an ox team, hauling logs to a sawmill. He worked as a carpenter, managed a potato farm, sheared sheep in Colorado, and installed early hand-crank telephones. Throughout his life, my father had tried to better himself through work. He moved to Columbus, Ohio, and became a streetcar motorman. The insides of these early trolleys were heated by pot-bellied stove, but the vestibules where the motormen stood were open. During the winter of 1906, his feet became frostbitten. Complaints to the company went unheard, so he organized a protest by the motormen and the conductors. They managed to get a bill passed in the state legislature requiring that vestibules be closed and heated. Nonetheless, the battle had left him frustrated and discouraged, and he decided to move to Southern California, where at least frostbite wouldn't be a problem. In 1907, he got a job as a motorman in the Pacific Electric streetcar line that ran between Los Angeles and Whittier. In 1908, he met Hannah Milhous at a Valentine's party, and despite the reservations of her family because she had not finished college, and because her suitor was not a Quaker, they married 4 months later. My father had an Irish quickness to both anger and to mirth. It was his temper that impressed me the most as a small child. He had tempestuous arguments with my brothers, Harold and Don, and their shouting could be heard all throughout the neighborhood. He was a strict and stern disciplinarian, and when I tried to follow my mother's example of not crossing him when he was in a bad mood. Perhaps my own aversion to personal confrontations dates back to these early recollections. He often argued vehemently on almost any subject with the customers he waited out on in the store. His outbursts were not personal. They were just his way of putting life into a discussion. Unfortunately, some of our customers did not appreciate this, and it was a standing family joke that my mother or one of the boys would rush out to wait on some of our more sensitive customers before he could get to them. Whatever talent I have as a debater must have been acquired from my father, from his love of argument and disputation. When I was on the debating team in college, he would often drive me to the debates and sit in the back of the room, listening intently. On the way home, he would dissect and analyze each of the arguments. My father had a deep belief in the little man in America. He opposed the idea of vested interest and the political machines that exercised so much control over the American life at the beginning of the century. Because he thought the Standard Oil Trust was a blight on the American landscape, he chose to be supplied by the less-known Richfield Oil Company when he opened his service station in Whittier. As the Nixon market grew, he became a vociferous opponent of chain stores. He feared that through their volume buying, they would crush the independent operator in the family grocery store. In those days before television and radio was still in an infancy, conversation within the family and among friends was a major source of recreation. Lively discussions of political views were always a feature of our family gatherings. My father started out as a hardline Ohio Republican. In 1924, however, he became disenchanted with the stand-pat republicanism of Hardin and Coolidge. A populist strain entered his thinking, and that year he deserted his party to vote for the great Wisconsin progressive Senator Robert Fighting Bob La Follette. He even became an ardent supporter of the Townsend Plan, which proposed paying $200 a month to everyone over 60 who would spend the money and agree to retire, a program which was too liberal even for the New Deal. He supported Hoover in 1932 because Hoover was a dry and FDR was a wet on prohibition. He never told me how he voted in 1936, but I always suspected that in the midst of the Depression he voted for Franklin Delano Roosevelt rather than Alf Landon, whom he once described as a stand-patter. The dignity of labor was the keystone of my father's philosophy of life. He said that taking too seriously the biblical invitation to lean on the Lord encouraged laziness, and his favorite biblical passage was, "In the sweat of thy face shalt thou have bread." During the long period when my father Harold had tuberculosis, the years of the Great Depression, my father refused to let him go to the country tuberculosis hospital, one of the best in the country, that going there would be taking charity. My father's temper may have been exacerbated by a partial deafness that became almost total as he grew older. There were times I suspected him of provoking a commotion just so he could turn off his hearing aid and watch the drama unfold before him like a silent movie. But it is the love between his brusque and bristling exterior that I remember best. When he and my mother came to New York to set me off at the Herder Committee trip to Europe in 1947, Pat and I arranged a special treat for them. He particularly loved musical comedy, and I was able to get the best seats for the Broadway hit Oklahoma. We had to rush from the hotel to the theater, and on the way he discovered that he left his hearing aid in his room. He was determined that he would not spoil our evening, and I remembered how intently he followed the play, and how he laughed and how he applauded with the rest of the audience, so that we would think he was having a good time, even though he could not hear a single word or a single note. My father's interest in politics made him the most enthusiastic follower of my career from its beginnings. My success meant to him that everything he had worked for and behaved in was true. My success meant to him that everything he had worked for and believed in was true, that in America, with hard work and determination, a man can achieve anything. During the years I was in Congress, I sent home copies of the Congressional Report. He read them cover to cover, something that no congressman or senator I knew ever took the time to do. When I was running for vice president, he wrote a typically straightforward letter to one of the newspapers he had read years before, suggesting that it support me. "This boy is one of 5 that I raised, and they are the finest, I think, in the United States. If you care to give him a lift, I would say the Ohio State Journal is still doing some good. Everyone who knew my mother was impressed with what a remarkable woman she is. She was born on March 7, 1885, in southern Indiana, into an Irish Quaker family of 9 children. When she was 12, her father decided to move to a Quaker settlement in California. They loaded a railroad boxcar with many of their possessions, including horses and saddles, doors, and window frames, and arrived at Whittier in 1897, where my grandfather opened a tree nursery and planted orange grove. After graduating from Whittier Academy, my mother went to Whittier College. She loved history and literature, and she majored in languages, concentrating in Latin, Greek, and German. When she married my father, she had completed her second year of college. They had 5 sons, and with the exception of one named for my father, she named us after the early kings of England: Harold, born in 1909, Richard, born in 1913, Francis Donald, born in 1914, and Arthur, born in 1918, and Edward, born in 1930. My mother was always concerned and active in community affairs, but her most striking quality was a deep sense of privacy. Although she radiated warmth and love for her family, indeed, for all people, she was intently private about her feelings and emotions. We never had a meal without saying grace, except for special occasions when each of us boys would be called on to recite a verse from the Bible. These prayers were always silent. She even took literally the injunction of St. Matthew that praying should be done behind closed doors, and went into a closet to say her prayers before going to bed at night. Often when I had done a difficult decision to make or a speech to prepare, when I was under attack in the press, my mother would say, "I will be thinking of you." This was her quiet Quaker way of saying, "I will be praying for you," and it meant infinitely more to me because of its understatement. Many people who knew my mother in Whittier referred to her, even in her lifetime, as Quaker Saint. My cousin, Jessamine West, recently wrote to me about my mother. She said, "I don't think Hannah is a saint. Saints, I feel, have a special pipeline to God which provides them a fortitude not given ordinary mortals. Hannah was not ordinary, but she did what she did and was what she was through a strength and lovingness which she welled up out of her own good heart, and because of her own indomitable character. The quality that made my mother so special, and that made people want to be close to her, was that although her inner serenity religion gave her shone through, she never wore her religion on her sleeve. As a child, I spent hours sitting at the piano in our living room picking out tunes. Shortly after I began school, I started taking piano lessons from my Uncle Griffith Milhous. He taught me the fundamentals of the violin. Probably because of my Uncle Griffith's urgings, my parents decided to give my musical abilities a real test. My mother's sister Jane had studied piano in the Metropolitan School of Music in Indianapolis, and was an accomplished performer and teacher. She lived with her own family in Lindsay, another Quaker enclave in Central California. It was decided that I should live with them for half a year and take lessons from her. Right after a family reunion at my grandmother's house in December 1924, I went home with Aunt Jane and Uncle Harold Beeson and my cousins Alden and Sheldon. For 6 months, I took daily piano lessons from Aunt Jane and violin lessons from a teacher in nearby Exeter, and walked 1.5 miles each way to school with Alden and Sheldon. I enjoyed studying music, and I was able to memorize it quite quickly. Even today, more than 50 years later, I still remember some of the music I learned back in Lindsay. Playing the piano was a way of expressing oneself that is perhaps more fulfilling than writing or speaking. In fact, I have always had 2 great and still unfulfilled ambitions: to direct a symphony orchestra and to play an organ in a cathedral. I think that to create great music is one of the highest aspirations man can set for himself. My parents came to bring me home in June 1925. Like any 12-year-old, I was happy to see them after what seemed to be a very long time. As soon as he saw me alone, my youngest brother Arthur greeted me with a solemn kiss on the cheek. I later learned that he asked my mother if it would be proper for him to kiss me since I had been away. Even at that early age, he had acquired our family's reticence and about open displays of affection. A short time after he returned to Whittier, Arthur complained of a headache. The family doctor thought it was the flu and ordered him. Arthur's condition deteriorated quickly, and the doctor was unable to find the cause. He described a series of tests, including a spinal tap. After that, most painful of tests had to be taken. I remember my father coming downstairs. It was the first time I had ever seen him cry. He said, "The doctors are afraid that little darling is going to die." Because Arthur required constant care and attention, Dot and I were sent away to live with my Aunt Carrie Wildermouth in Fullerton. Just before we left, we went upstairs to see our brother. He had asked for one of his favorite dishes, tomato gravy on toast. We brought some with us, and I remember how much he enjoyed it. 2 days later, he died. The doctor said it was tuberculosis encephalitis, but those words were too big, too cold, too impersonal to grasp or understand. My father, who had been keeping the service station open on Sundays to accommodate the increasing weekend traffic on Whittier Boulevard, half believed that Arthur's death represented some kind of divine displeasure, and he never opened the station or the market on a Sunday. For weeks after Arthur's funeral, there was not a day where I did not think about him and cry. For the first time, I had learned what death was like and what it meant. As a freshman in college, I wrote a short essay about Arthur for an English composition course. I described the photograph of Arthur that my mother had always kept in our living room, and I wrote, "Let me tell you, in a few words, something of my brother as I remember him." The first 2 or 3 years of my baby's brother's life are a rather indistinct memory, for when I was engrossed in the first years of grammar school and the first 2 or 3 years of my baby brother's life are rather indistinct in my memory, for I was engrossed in the first years of my grammar school education. However, there were certain things concerned with my little brother's early development which did impress me. For example, I remember how his eyes changed from their original baby blue to an almost black shade, how his hair, blonde at first, had become dark brown, how his mouth, toothless for 5 months, was filled with tiny, white teeth, which, by the way, were exceedingly sharp when they're applied on soft fingers or toes, which happened to get within their reach. How those little incoherent sounds of his finally developed into words and then into sentences, and how he learned to roll over, then to crawl, and finally to walk. Although I do not remember many incidents concerned with my brother's early childhood, there were some which made a clear imprint on my mind. There was one time where he asked to be my ring bearer at a wedding. I remember how my mother had to work with him for hours to get him to do it, because he disliked walking with the little flower girl. Another time, when he was about 5 years old, he showed the world that he was a man by getting some cigarettes out of our store and secretly smoking them back of the house. Unfortunately for him, one of our gossipy neighbors happened to see him, and she promptly informed my mother. I have disliked that neighbor from that time. Again, I shall never forget how he disliked wearing sticky wool suits, and as soon as he was able to read, he used to search the mail order catalogs for suit which weren't sticky. There is a growing tendency among college students to let their childhood beliefs be forgotten. Especially we find this true when we speak of the divine creator with his plans for us. I thought I would also become that way, but I find that it is almost impossible for me to do so. 2 days before my brother's death, he called me into the room. He put his arms around her 2 days before my brother's death, he called my mother into the room. He put his arms around her and said that he wanted to pray before he went to sleep. Then he closed his eyes. He repeated that age-old child's prayer with ends with those simple yet beautiful words, "If I should die before I wake, I pray thee, Lord, my soul to take." If there is a grave out in the hills, there is a grave out in the hills, but, like the picture, it only contains the bodily image of my brother. And so, when I am tired and worried, and am almost ready to quit to live as I should, I look up to see the picture of my little boy with sparkling eyes. And so when I am tired and worried and am almost ready to quit trying to live as I should, I look up and see the picture of a little boy with sparkling eyes and curly hair. I remember the childlike prayer. I pray that it may prove true for me as it did for my brother, Arthur. My oldest brother Harold's long bout with tuberculosis began several years after Arthur died, but it continued for more than 10 years. It was especially hard for us to accept because he had had such a robust enjoyment of life. He was tall and handsome with blue eyes and blonde hair. At one point he grew a mustache that made him look quite rakish. In high school he had a stripped-down Model T Ford that he raced with his friends. It was during Harold's long illness that my mother showed the depth of her character and faith. In those days, TB was almost always incurable, and the long losing fight left its tragic mark on our whole family. First, Harold went to an expensive private sanatorium. Then he spent a few years in a cottage in the Antelope Valley in California, which was considerably drier than the Whittier area. Eventually, my mother decided to take him to live in Prescott, Arizona, which was supposed to be excellent for tuberculosis cures because of its dry climate and high elevation. She stayed with Harold in Prescott for almost 3 years. To make ends meet, she took care of 3 other bedridden patients. She cooked and cleaned, gave them bed baths and alcohol rubs, and did everything that a nurse does for a patient. Later, as she heard that one by one had died, I could tell that she felt their deaths as deeply as if they had been her own sons. In addition to the wrenching physical and emotional strain of nursing, the very fact of separation from the rest of us was very hard on my mother. My father regularly made the 14-hour drive to Prescott with Don and May during Christmas and spring vacations, and we spent part of our summers there. During those 2 summers in Prescott, I worked at any odd job I could find. I was a janitor at a swimming pool, and once I helped pluck and dress frying chickens for a butcher shop. I also worked as a carnival barker at the Frontier Days Festival that is still celebrated in Prescott every day. Harold's illness began to drag on. He became so thin it was almost painful to look at him. He was terribly unhappy and homesick in Prescott, so it was finally decided to let him come home, hoping that the familiar surroundings would compensate for the damper climate. He had a desperate will to live and refused to comply with the doctor's orders that he stay in bed. It was especially painful for all of us because Harold was still so full of hope and had so much life in him. We kept hoping against hope that some mental lift might start him on the way back to physical recovery. When he said that he would like to go through the San Bernardino Mountains to see the desert, my father dropped everything to make plans for the trip. He rented one of the first house trailers on the market, a wooden stretcher built on a Rio truck chassis, and spent several hours with Harold planning their route and their itinerary. We saw them off one morning, expecting to be gone for almost a month. They were back 3 days later. Harold had another hemorrhage, and despite his insistence that they go on, my father knew that Harold would not be able to stand the rigors of living in the trailer. Harold told me that he was nevertheless glad they had taken even the short trip, and I can remember his voice when he described the beauty of the wildflowers in the foothills. Never see them. On March 6, 1933, Harold asked me to drive him downtown. He had seen an ad for a new kind of electric cake mixer, and he wanted to give our mother for her birthday. The next day, he barely had the strength to walk with me to the hardware store. He had them wrap the mixer as a birthday present, and we hid it at home at the top of the closet. The next morning, he said that we would postpone giving our presents to our mother until that night because he would not feel well and wanted to rest. About 3 hours later, I was studying in the college library when I received a message to come home. When I got there, I saw a hearse parked in the front of the house. My parents were crying uncontrollably as the undertaker carried out Harold's body. My mother said that right after I left for school, Harold asked her to put her arms around him and hold him very close. He had never been particularly religious, but he looked at her and said, "This is the last time I will see you, until we meet in heaven." He died an hour later. That night, I got the cake mixer out and gave it to my mother and told her that it was Harold's gift to her. I loved my parents equally, but in very different ways, just as they were different people. My father was a scrappy, belligerent fighter with a quick, wide-ranging, raw intellect. He told me a respect for learning and hard work, and the will to keep fighting no matter the odds. My mother loved me completely and selflessly, and her special legacy was a quiet inner peace, and the determined was never to despair.
We need Nixon, let's vote